Van harte welkom bij dit Symposium Professional Ethics and Normative Professionalization, a Critical Dialogue. Deze dag organiseren we bij de Universiteit voor Humanistiek samen met Harry Kunneman en de groep Normatieve Professionalisering. Tezamen met het lectoraat Innovatie en Maatschappelijke Dienstverlening van de Hogeschool Utrecht. Mijn naam is Lia van Doorn. Wij hebben dit mede georganiseerd met Harry Kunneman. Deze dag bestaat uit twee keynote speakers en een serie workshops. De eerste spreker is Sarah Banks, professor Dr. Sarah Banks van de Durham University, United Kingdom. En Sarah Banks is een bekende leading lady op het terrein van social work en ethics, social work en ethiek. Ze heeft veel gepubliceerd de afgelopen jaren over dat onderwerp. Een aantal van haar boeken hebben hun weg gevonden. Bijvoorbeeld mijn persoonlijke favoriet is het boek Practicing Social Work and Ethics Around the World. Met cases, ethische kwesties beschreven, casuïstiek en commentaar daarop uit wel 20 landen in Europa. Sarah Banks zal zo meteen haar presentatie geven, Ethics Work in the Social Domain.
Thank you to the two universities, the Hogeschool Utrecht and also the University of Humanistics, for inviting me here, for organising such a wonderful conference. I'm here today hoping to learn as much, if not more, from you as you may from me, because I think in Holland you're renowned for your work on practical ethics, on empirical ethics, and particularly here in this university, the work on normative professionalisation and on the ethics of care, I think is leading the way in the world. So for me it is a great honour and privilege to be here, and also I'm here with some trepidation because you Dutch, I think, are such experts in this field. Who knows what critical comments you'll apply, and I do want some critical comments and to engage in a dialogue with you. My theme for today, I've called it Everyday Ethics in Professional Life, Social Work as Ethics Work. But before I move on to the talk, you'll see on the left is a picture of Durham. Some people, particularly Dutch people, I think know where Durham is. Many people, particularly Americans, don't know where it is and talk of it as Durham and think of it as in North Carolina. But Durham is in the northeast of the UK and is a rather beautiful city with a wonderful cathedral and castle and university. So I'm just showing a little picture of Durham in the snow. Actually, this year we didn't get much snow, but Durham in the snow, and would like to invite any of you who wish to travel to the UK to come and visit us at Durham University, where we do our social work, community work and youth work studies. So my theme today is everyday ethics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing face of social work, and you're experiencing changes in Holland as we are in the UK and in many parts of the world. I'll then talk a little bit about what I call the turn to professional ethics by academics and policymakers, and look at different versions of ethics, including everyday ethics. And then look a bit about what this means for practice, for social work practitioners. I'll introduce the concept of ethics work, and we'll look finally again at the implications for education and learning in social work. So I think all people here will be familiar with the changes that have been taking place now for several decades. And I think part of the impetus, as I understand it, for the theme of normative professionalisation as developed here was as a counterbalance to the technical approach in the professions generally and in social welfare or social professions more particularly. And so we're all quite familiar now with the push for practice that's based on evidence, so the research that we do should produce concrete evidence and toolkits, as Ed was telling me, for practitioners to use. There's a trend towards manuals, procedures, and less personal engagement, face-to-face contact between social workers and service users. The managerialisation is happening quite persistently. At first, I thought when we entered this period of austerity, the financial crisis, there was a push in the UK to get rid of bureaucracy and what we call red tape. But of course, that hasn't necessarily happened. Jobs have been got rid of, but there's more bureaucracy insofar as different social welfare organisations are competing for contracts to provide welfare services. There is more targeting of the individuals who are in need and measurement of the results. And I was just telling Ed earlier that we have this invidious idea of payment by results, and we're just reforming our probation service in the UK that deals with ex-offenders and privatising part of it, and the private part, which will be taken over by private companies or NGOs, will be paid by the result being, of course, that the offender does not reoffend and does not go back to prison. So more about professional accountability, public accountability, again less on the professional autonomy. The marketisation, the concern with efficiency and with profit, the responsibilisation, I have all these big English words with isation on the end, so it sounds good, but making people feel and be responsible for their own care or for the care within their families and communities. And maybe finally a good word, a democratisation, at least we think it's good, it sounds good, although it may be strongly linked with making people responsible as well, of course. The increasing push for service users and communities to play a role in not only their own care, but in decisions about what happens in their particular communities. But often this is just a cover for withdrawal of professional services and increasing reliance on families and communities. So social work in Europe, I think, is set within this changing context. In each country, it works out slightly differently, depending on the traditions and the laws. But generally, these are the trends that we find. So, welcome, Richard. You have a music to welcome you into the room. Our colleague from Belgium. So, delighted to see you, Richard. So, we're also seeing at the same time as we're having these trends towards new managerialism, neoliberal values, we have a turn to ethics. So this is particularly notable in the academic field. And it's not just in social work, obviously. We find this across the picture. And it's partly to do with the great global problems that we're facing, whether we're talking about global warming, famine, genetic developments. The issues about what counts as a good life, what counts for human flourishing are strong in our minds. And not surprisingly, academics are writing a lot about issues of rights, responsibilities, the good life, etc. But there's also a kind of academic industry. I was just talking to Leah before we started about the UK university system, which pushes very strongly now for research and the measurement of our research. And there's a kind of academic industry of producing more and more research, and particularly developing subfields. So professional ethics has become a subfield, quite a recognisable one now in social work. So that was just a photograph of just a few of the books that are on my bookshelf in English. Now, if I added the books in Dutch, I think we'd probably get a whole load more spreading out there. So there's a lot of textbooks and academic books generally on ethics. And as I say, it's part of a global trend of interest in ethics, but also in the social work field, it's part of a trend to again, counterbalance the new managerialism, the technicisation of the practice. To say there's more to social work than just technical competence, tight management and profit. And I'm glad this is your favourite book, Leah. This is also my favourite book, not because I edited it particularly, but because I only edited it, meaning there's lots of other people who wrote in there from different countries around the world. And I have learnt so much from that book because it has cases from different countries and it has commentaries from people from different countries. So I'm going to refer to one or two cases from that book. So I've mentioned that just so you know that's where some of the examples from practice are coming from. So what about the turn to ethics amongst academics? There's a re-emphasis on what I call traditional professional ethics, on respect, the Kantian or deontological approach to ethics of respecting the service users as fellow citizens, respecting their rights to freedom of choice, enhancing their autonomy, and promoting human rights more generally within a framework of ethical principles and a concern with ethical dilemmas, ethical decision-making, using reasoning. And insofar as these academic textbooks are based on moral philosophy, then it tends to be what we call principle-based ethics, the general principles of respect for the individual, promotion of public welfare, etc. So both deontological and consequentialist principles in a traditional fashion. And there is a mushrooming of textbooks, and I am partly to blame because I also write textbooks in this area. The other area that academics are writing about, I have called everyday ethics in professional life, because it's much more about ethics being embedded in the whole of a professional's working life and even personal life. So the focus on caring relationships between the service user and the professional, not just rights, but actually the care, and which involves emotion, trust, a focus on social justice, the responsibility of the professionals to take action, to promote greater equality, to tackle oppression, etc. The importance of the moral character of the professional worker, and the political context, recognising that social work is located in whatever country or province in a particular context of laws, culture and balance of power. And insofar as these moves are influenced by moral philosophy, we tend to find these deriving more from the ethics of care, which in Holland I think a lot of work has been done, particularly from the group now based here. Virtue ethics, situation ethics, and also empirical ethics. This is much newer as a focus, where researchers are doing empirical work. Again, the group at the Hoge School is doing an awful lot of empirical research with social workers, and we'll be hearing about more of that in the workshops. And also drawing from disciplines other than philosophy, the idea that philosophers do not have a monopoly on ethics, although sometimes philosophers don't like it when other people take on ethics, but quite a lot of literature from moral psychology, particularly looking at the way in which the brain works, and there's a whole debate about the extent to which our moral judgments are based on intuition or rationality. Sociology, anthropology, a whole load of different disciplines are now looking at ethics and obviously seeing it much more as embedded in daily practice. So that is a very interesting and important development, I think, to which the researchers in Holland have contributed a lot. And the policymakers have also turned to ethics. Quite often we're tempted to think that the new managerialist practices, the bureaucracies, are not really about ethics, but in a way they also have their own ethical impetus and their own ethical justifications. And so the idea of making manuals, procedures, rules for working is partly to ensure fairness, to ensure that social workers don't act with favouritism towards particular people, that they distribute the resources according to need, not according to who they like or mistakenly think would benefit. So the idea of the standards, the rules, and socially beneficial outcomes, the example I gave earlier about probation officers and trying to discourage people from going back to prison, obviously is working for socially beneficial outcomes. So there's a kind of utilitarian ethics at work here in what I call the new managerialist ethics. So 3 different types of ethics, and because social workers always like to have things in tables and categories, etc., I am at risk of sort of doing what I say we shouldn't do, which is simplifying things. But here's a little table, and not only tables, but you'll see I've got a little area of C's, 9 C's, and that's always a bit too simple and slick, but I couldn't stop myself from doing it. And it won't translate into other languages anyway, because they won't all be C's. But just to summarise, what I call the traditional professional ethics as focusing on ethics as decision making. That's not all it focuses on, but particularly in the textbooks, the focus is on, let's look at some ethical dilemmas. How do social workers make decisions? What reasons do they use? How do they call upon the principles? So the focus is on the conduct, the actions of the social worker. What do they do? What should they do? It's on codes of ethics, which tend to be based on sets of principles, and often cases. I've myself produced a book of cases. Quite often in the textbooks they tend to be short cases, quite abstract, not necessarily saying much about the character of the people involved or the emotions or even where they're located. And a dominant focus on respect and rights for the individual service user. Again, that's not all there is to professional ethics, but that's just the main focus. The shift towards ethics in professional life sees ethics much more as embedded, as I mentioned, and also embodied. I didn't put the word embodied there, but embodied in my person, my body, which brings in the feelings, the emotions, as well as the head. It includes the heart. So an interest in character, moral qualities such as courage or compassion, and the commitment of the practitioner, the motivation for doing the work, the idea of vocation, which in some contexts now may seem strangely old-fashioned, that as a social worker you might have a vocation and a personal commitment and investment in doing a job well. And finally, the context, the importance of the political context, of the context in terms of the relationships and responsibilities that the workers have, in contrast to the rather abstract cases in traditional professional ethics. And some of the key terms there are about care and social justice. Whereas the new managerial ethics has much more of a focus on ethics as regulation, ensuring that social workers follow the rules and behave well, that they have competencies, and I'm using the term competencies, you'll see, rather than competence. We could probably have an argument about the use of these terms, but competence is a general ability to do things. Competencies, we've been using them in the UK to refer to almost skills, so particular abilities to do particular things in specific situations for which you would require training but not necessarily education. So that's why I put that word in there. Conformity to the rules, and categories, obviously I had to put that in because it begins with a C, but it's about categorising people, filling in boxes, filling in forms, ticking boxes. Are you ineligible or eligible for a service? And the focus on fairness and good outcomes. So that's my simplistic picture of 3 approaches to ethics. And you can see how the everyday ethics is really about what you might call a thickening of ethics. That is, you're adding more detail, it's embedded in context. You can't abstract out the principle without it losing its meaning, whereas the new managerial ethics is a thinning, it's reducing things to rules and procedures. Okay, so that was that. And Yes, just so you don't think that I'm always working in boxes, I did play around with circles, because obviously there are interconnections and interweavings. These are just three ideal types in a way. And what I've called traditional professional ethics in the middle there, of course, has always had a concern for social justice and fairness and good outcomes, as well as respect and rights. And it's constantly moving and being affected by issues in practice and in policy. And part of the problem at the moment, I think, is that professional ethics is being shifted into this right-hand circle, that there's more emphasis on the new managerial ethics, the fairness, the outcomes, the regulation, the professional conduct. And so what counts as ethics is beginning to be more in this area here. And so part of what we're trying to do is to shift it back a bit over to the other side. And so I've talked about the turn to ethics in terms of academics and policymakers. But what about practitioners? So is there a turn to ethics by practitioners? Well, obviously there is, insofar as new managerialism permeates social work practice, then inevitably there is a discourse of outcomes, performance, fairness, equity, that is common in social work practice. At least I find that in the UK, and I'm sure I'll be interested to hear how it is in Holland. So social workers and managers, and particularly managers, because they're the ones who are overseeing the work and the money, talk about transparency, fairness, equity, rationing, good outcomes for service users. So an example from a UK social worker who takes all new referrals for adult social care services, and she talked about how she found it much better when they introduced some criteria for who was eligible for services and who wasn't. And when people phoned in, she could ask them a set of questions and tick a set of boxes, and could then decide whether to refer them on for further support from a social worker, or whether to say, well, sorry, no, you don't fit our criteria. And until she had that pro forma, she felt that she was having to take responsibility, and now she's much more confident in saying that she can't provide something and why. And that's just one very small example. There is a turn, of course, to traditional professional ethics, and I noticed that being invoked particularly when social workers judge or challenge what they see as dehumanising or unjust policies and practices, and when they're arguing a case. Obviously, when arguing a case for services, for support, for a particular approach to a service user, then the talk can be and should be about rights, about dignity, about respect. And one example from the book that Leah mentioned is a Peruvian social worker who was advocating for a woman whose child was judged to be ineligible for treatment under the rules for state healthcare insurance. And this social worker was trying to get healthcare insurance for the woman and her child, and talked about the most important principles, according to her analysis as a social worker, were about the child's right to health. So bringing in rights is a very important approach. And what about everyday ethics? Obviously, social workers carrying out their everyday practice as far as they can do so based on caring relationships, empathy, and trying to resist social injustice wherever they see it. I say insofar as they can because we also have many examples where people find they can't do that. But a lot of social workers are doing very competent, caring, good practice. But it may be, what they're doing may be hidden, in that it's not valued, measured, or widely understood. We all know that the only time social work gets in the news is when there is a scandal, when a child dies or an adult is abused. But the ordinary everyday practice, it doesn't hit the headlines. And in social work now, a lot of the practice that goes on may be undercover because the social workers are bending or breaking the rules. It was interesting in looking in the cases in this book. I was looking particularly at the ones that bend and break rules, and there's quite a few of them in there. And that's partly because when you ask people to give examples of an ethics case, then the ones that spring to mind will be ones that may be about when they are a heroine who broke the rules in order to do good in the world. But there's quite a bit of that going on. And for example, a UK childcare social worker assessing the needs of a family with a troubled child doesn't ask all the required questions on the assessment form, as she judges them irrelevant to the context, and they have to add insulting to the family. So she's doing what she thinks is good relationships with the family. She's not actually following the rules. However, there may also be a turn from ethics by practitioners. A lot of the research that is being done at the moment and writings by social workers in the social work magazines suggests that they're finding it increasingly difficult to follow traditional professional ethics or even embed ethics in their everyday practice. So, for example, we find cases of what are called here moral bystanding, simply doing the job uncritically. So knowing something is wrong, perhaps, but not able to do anything about it. You don't find, when you do research, you don't and interview people, I don't know what you found in your research, but you don't find many people openly admitting to just doing the job and committing bad practice and doing nothing about it. But if you do observations and if you listen to students, those of you who teach, which I think quite a few of you do, will probably have this experience of the student comes in and tells you the horror story. Well, my supervisor, would you believe what they do? You know, they don't pay attention to the needs of people. They're ignoring people. So one gets the stories of the bad practice, but not necessarily from the social workers themselves. But for many social workers, they may be burnt out. They're overwhelmed by the amount of work they have to do and the rules and procedures that they have to follow. The other category I talk about is moral distress. This may be what Harry calls dolor complexitatis, I think, translating into Latin. But it's about knowing the right thing to do but not being able to do it, and experiencing that kind of distress and feeling that they should have done something different but actually can't because of the rules, the procedures, or again just simply not having enough time. And there's one particular case from a social worker where she said my head was screaming. She had a phone call from a man and she was praying that this man didn't need anything from her because she was already behind with her work and she was just filling in for somebody in the contact centre. And if this man did need some further work, if he was eligible for more services, she would then have to ask him about a 20 or 30-minute set of questions in order for him to be allowed to have a form sent to him, which he then might be able to fill in and get some further services. And if that man seemed like he had a need, she would then have to do that, and she knew she hadn't got time to do it. But then she's reflecting, I shouldn't be thinking like that. So she's suffering a great deal of distress, and in fact that social worker left her job shortly afterwards because she was too stressed by it. The third bullet point there is the turn to politics. In the UK, certainly, we have more people who are turning to blowing the whistle, engaging in protest campaigns, collective action, and partly, I said more, but I mean it's a small number of people, but these things are happening because there's protests about closure of services because of the cuts in public spending. So there's more opportunity now for social workers to take collective action. And the idea that this is about politics assumes a distinction, I think, between ethics and politics, and sees ethics as either new managerial or traditional professional ethics. I've been accused, because I have this burning interest in ethics, I've been accused of being part of a turn from politics to ethics. So the idea that by focusing on ethics, on the individual, the responsibility of the individual, the fairness of the limited resources, is one turning away from the bigger political picture. But I want to argue for the everyday ethics as also about politics, that you can't divorce ethics from this bigger political picture. But that's part of the problem that's happened with the traditional professional ethics and also the new managerial ethics, which is part of the bigger picture, but it's not critically part of the bigger picture. So seeing everyday ethics as perhaps ethico-politics, it's about the political context, and it's about reclaiming ethics from managerial and neoliberal values. And so one of the ideas that I've developed was a situated ethics of social justice, and that was my last talk in Utrecht, which I gave at the Hogeschool, and is written up in this very good Dutch journal of social intervention. So if any of you want to read that, but above all, read that journal if you haven't already read it, because most of the articles, except for a few like mine, are in Dutch. And the ones that I have read in English are very good. I wish more of them were in English and I could read them. So that was just a talk that I gave 2 years ago, I think, wasn't it? On World Social Work Day. Yeah. And some of the values that I suggested there, but this is not going to be a repeat because some of you have already heard that talk. But it obviously links with my idea of everyday ethics and the concept of ethics work. And I'm just reminding myself of the time. I should finish at 20 past 10, is that right?
Yeah, about.
Yeah.
Then there's time to ask questions.
Yeah, okay. So this idea that ethics work is the effort that social workers put into seeing the ethically salient, important aspects of situations, developing themselves as good practitioners, working out the right course of action, and justifying who they are and what they have done. Now, social workers do this all the time, but it needs to be recognised, valued, and educated for. And I just heard about some of the best practice workshops that the group from the Hogeschool is doing with practitioners. And I think probably what's happening there is that they're being encouraged to do ethics work and to value it and to see it for what it is. But because it's embedded in practice, then the question often arises, well, isn't this just good practice? It's only just decent quality practice. What's so ethical about it? And in English, this word just can mean only, simply. It's only good, that is, normal, decent, good practice. But if we put a comma in, then social work as just, which is an adjective, good practice. Then just, of course, can mean fair. It's about promoting justice. And good can have another meaning, of course, apart from just decent or normal. It can also mean promoting human flourishing. So ethics work is about promoting justice and considerations of human flourishing. And I developed this idea. It's nothing particularly new or different, but having done a lot of work with social workers and students and collected cases and done interviews and observed practice, it seems to me there was a lot of work going on. And I'm using the term work advisedly to talk about not only the cognitive work, but also the emotional work and the bodily work and the performance work that goes on in everyday practice. So the first element I call framing work, which is clearly, if you think of a picture frame, what are you putting in the picture? Who is in the foreground? Who is in the background? Which service users go where? Where do the resources and the managers go? So where one places people in the picture, and of course also placing oneself, the social worker, in the picture too, being reflexive and placing the politics and the social in there too. Role work, which is about playing a role in relation to other people. social workers take on a variety of roles as advocates, carers, critics. We may be partial, impartial. Emotion work, both generating compassion and care on occasions when you may not feel like it, and managing the emotions. Identity work, so working on one's ethical self, creating an identity as an ethically good practitioner, maintaining one's integrity as a professional. Reason work, which is often where a lot of focus is placed in traditional ethics. It's still very important, but I haven't put it at the top, but about making moral judgments and decisions, being able to justify what you do and why, maybe according to principles and rules or other reasons. And finally, I've added performance work, which may, you think, be part of the other characteristics, but I've added it in as an extra overall element about making visible aspects of the work to others and demonstrating oneself at work. Because if nobody sees what you're doing, they may not realise that it's not just ordinary, everyday good practice, but there's actually an element of ethics and being accountable in there. And I'll illustrate this very, very briefly with a case from the book. The cases in that book are deliberately long. They're about 2 or 3 pages. And I asked the social workers who gave them to me to put in some details about what they felt and why, etc. So in this little summary, I can't do more than give you a brief abstract account, but it's about a social worker who worked in Peru for a government health insurance office. And there were various rules for who could get the health insurance, but basically if you had another form of private insurance or work insurance, then you couldn't get the state healthcare insurance. And a woman and a child came to a health institute, and the staff judged that the woman was not eligible because she had a husband. The husband was not living with them, the husband was not in communication, the husband didn't give them any money, but the husband actually had his own health insurance. And then the social worker has to deal with this in the insurance office, and she gives an account of herself doing a lot of work to justify and reason and to get healthcare insurance for this particular woman, and also doing further work to try to change the policy so that other families don't suffer in the same way. And she commented that this case struck at the heart of my professional identity as a social worker and raised issues about the relationship between professional and public responsibilities. So in that case, we can see the framing work. Actually, because she was writing an ethics case, of course she's framing it as an ethics case. She frames it as a dilemma. What do I do? This woman doesn't fit the rules, but shall I actually make a case for her? She's placing herself there. She's doing quite a bit of advocacy here. She's taking a position, but she's trying to make it impartial. She would do the same for other similar people. There's not a lot about emotion, but she does talk about striking at the heart of her professional identity. She's clearly working on her ethical self because she talks about her identity, and she's presenting herself almost as a heroine, as the good social worker. She does a lot of reason work because she's making a case to her boss, and certainly performance work because she's performing for the reader of the book, as well as having to perform in the case for the boss. So making aspects of the work visible. So that was just a little example of how it might work in practice, and I'll skip over that. But in doing interviews and observations, it's often very hard to exactly see a lot about the framing and the emotion work that goes on. And these are 2 areas that I want to do more work on, because I think particularly the emotion work, which wasn't really evident in that case I've just shown you, but is in some others, is about the kind of empathic imagination that the social worker uses to put herself in the place of the service users and engage with them in a meaningful way. So that, I think, is quite an important aspect. So this is my final slide. just as well, because I think I'm running out of voice. So what are the implications for learning, teaching and study and research? It's important to see that ethics is everywhere, not just in the textbooks or not just when you face a dilemma or a difficult decision. It's embedded in practice learning and it's embedded across the curriculum if you're teaching. It's helpful to work with contextualised living cases, stories and accounts. One can learn an awful lot from that. And it's important to balance the logic with the passion, and using role plays, simulation, literature, poetry, drama adds to the kind of rational approach that we have. And I know this is how I used to do it and still do it to some extent. You present a case to students and you say, here's a dilemma, what would you do? What are the arguments for and against? These might be the deontological arguments, these might be the utilitarian arguments. What does one decide to do? And there's actually a lot more to it than that. One needs to engage with the moral emotions. One needs to do a lot of ethics work, which is more than just reasoning or rationality. And so focusing on developing capacities to do ethics work, including moral perception, which links with the idea of framing. What do you see in the picture? What don't you see in the picture? Like what I forgot to say about the Peru case was that the social worker put the husband out of the picture in a way. The people in the initial healthcare institute saw the husband. Have you got a husband with health insurance? Yes, okay, go away. The social worker put the woman and the child in the front of the picture. The man was a background, shadowy figure who actually didn't engage with the family. So how you frame, you're attentive to the moral features of the situation or the ethical sensitivities I think Ed is going to be talking about probably in his workshop. Recognising the political context and the practitioner's own professional power. Often in social work, you know, when I was a social worker, you feel like you have no power, and the students often forget that they have any power at all. But there is power, and we need to place ourselves in the picture and see how we can use our power. And the moral struggle, and it is a struggle, I think, to be a good practitioner, to maintain personal and professional integrity while carrying out the requirements of the agency role. And that is the end of the talk. Thank you. Take a chair.
Thank you, Sarah, for the very interesting speech that you gave. Perfect timing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Are there any questions? We've got almost 20 minutes until coffee break. So if there are any questions or comments, this is the time to ask.
Yeah.
There's a question.
Is that correct? There are various corporations with the work of Martin Nussbaum and the idea of emotions, Aristotelian ethics, and so on. When you talk about emotions, I think there are many comparisons with the work of Martin Nussbaum.
Yes.
And also Aristotelian ethics.
Yes, absolutely. I think Nussbaum's presentation of the emotions as having a cognitive as well as a feeling element is very important, and that is the version of the emotions. And as you say, Aristotle has a lot to say, particularly about practical reason and wisdom, which is really a blend of the affect and the cognitive. So I think we can learn a lot from the ancient Greek philosophers, and I think partly the turn to the idea of everyday ethics, some of it is grounded in an Aristotelian approach, as well as the ethics of care and other relationship-based approaches. Yeah.
You can also see emotions just as Nussbaum as a sort of cognitive part, not a part of stimulating cognitive processes, but a part of cognitive process themselves?
Yes, I think that's probably a good way of viewing emotions, that we need to have the emotions in order to be able to develop our thinking, and they contribute to our thinking and to our cognition, so that there isn't really that great separation between the feeling and the thinking. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
To stimulate the imagination for good work.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes, so I think that the concept of empathic imagination, starting with the empathy, but then taking it further to begin to imagine. To imagine, one needs not only the feelings, but also the ability to think creatively and to think of new possibilities. Yeah. Yeah. So is that an area that you're working on?
Yes, it's a part of my process I'm working with.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to talk to you a bit more about that later then. That sounds interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Because when we look at literature, does it make us better professionals when we read poetry, literature and so on?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it does. I'm sure it does, because but there are other ways of perhaps engaging with our emotions. But I think putting some literature, poetry, etc., into the professional curriculum, and also performance, theatre, is a very good way of engaging the emotions and the imagination, and encouraging the development of empathy, exploring different perspectives. I think for ethics teaching, that is very important, isn't it? To see new situations and challenge one's own perspectives. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions or ideas about how you connecting managerial ethics and the everyday ethics? Like how to create professional space and still create a formally responsible way they can practice their profession?
Yeah, I think there are ways of doing that, but it can be quite a challenge. From what I see when I go and visit people in the professional field, a lot of it depends upon the manager in a particular team or unit. Because in the UK, certainly, we have a lot of policies coming down from on high, from central and local government. And if the manager, him or herself, is more of a rule follower and not a risk taker, then you see that the team operates in that kind of way and has what I might call a managerialist ethics. But if the manager, who's in the middle really between the practice and the policy, is more creative and is willing to take risks and supports and supervises the workers in a more creative way, then you can see how there's a value placed on fairness. So it's not the case that one shouldn't have eligibility criteria. Of course, you should. It's important to be fair, that we don't just allocate resources on a whim. So that good blend, I think, of being fair, accountable, transparent, but not losing the time to spend with the service users, not losing the capacity to engage personally. So I see some teams where that's happening, but others where it's not. And the reasons may not just be about the manager, it may also be about the fact that lots of people are off sick and they're understaffed, and they just simply, as we say in English, working by the book. They're just doing the basics, doing the minimum. So I think unless one has the time and the commitment, particularly from the manager, it is very, very hard from what I've seen. I don't know what you think it's like here in Holland. Yeah.
But then do you think it's necessary that this manager comes from the working field?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? Well, in some ways I think that it can be very helpful, because then that manager knows what the work is about. They know the stresses, the tensions, and they've been trained in the values. But in some ways it also just depends on the character of that manager. So you can get very good managers, maybe who've come in from somewhere else. We have a company in the UK called Marks and Spencers. Do you hear of it? Yeah? Okay. Well, somehow or other, we get a manager. The manager, I remember, of Newcastle, the director of Newcastle Social Services came from Marks and Spencers. And so we have this sort of idea, whether we agree with it or not, but Marks and Spencers is also traditional, good old-fashioned British firm. Would it be quite so good if the manager came from British American Tobacco, for example, or British Nuclear Fuels? But anyway, that's a diversion. But I think there is, it seems to me, but I would say this, wouldn't I, because I did train as a social worker, that that understanding of practice from the inside is so very important. And those managers who don't have that, and in some ways they don't want it because they want to stand above it, they want to be distant, they need to be able to make the tough decisions, they need to sack people, and they need to measure performance, and they need to enforce some of the policies. So it's a tricky issue. What have you got a thought on that?
Well, I'm very inspired by a manager I know who
Yeah.
has her own caseload. Like
Yeah.
a little part of her time
Yes.
as a manager, she
Yes.
does her caseload.
Yeah.
And I think that
Yeah,
that's really inspiring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
But still, what you just said, like someone should make the tough decisions. That might be hard if you know the stories.
I think that's right. As a manager, you do need a certain kind of distance, don't you? And so that is, I think, being a what we call a middle manager in any job, but particularly in the social welfare field at the moment, is an incredibly hard position to be in. I don't know if any of you here are managers. I shouldn't be talking about managers when you're with some of you in the room because you know what it's like. But I think it's
not interested.
Well, too busy, probably. Yeah. No, not. Because in the UK at the moment we have a lot of cuts in services, and it's some of the people in the sort of middle tiers of management who have to make the cuts and to cut back services that they've developed, and then sack people, and then sometimes when they've done that, then they're also made redundant themselves, and so it is. In many occasions quite a difficult position to be in, but perhaps we're a bit tougher and meaner in the UK. Things are getting very tough and mean at the moment.
In what way? People are sacked or
Yes, because we have a programme of welfare reform built on our austerity programmes. So the local authorities that run state social services have all had massive reductions in their budgets from the central government. In some cases, over a period of about 3 to 5 years, there could be a third of their budgets going. So they're getting rid of what they see as non-essential services. So that includes youth work, community work. They're privatising and contracting out some of the care services, and they're getting them cheaper because the private sector comes in and they bid for contracts and they undercut the public sector. And then, of course, they don't deliver particularly well. And so some of the services that have been cut and people have been sacked, that's happening across all local authorities at the moment. Yeah.
which does something with trust, doesn't
Yeah.
it? Between the manager
Yes.
and the professional.
Yes,
And
it
which
does.
makes it very difficult
Yes.
to talk about complex situations.
Yes.
I spoke to a person this week.
Yeah.
She said, if I don't follow the rules, I get
Yeah.
sacked.
Yes.
I
Yes.
have to talk
Yes.
to my manager, but
Yes.
he's afraid to lose control.
Yeah.
Because if he says, okay, what
Yeah.
you do, and everybody
Yeah.
does it,
Yes.
they have no control,
Yeah.
which is difficult.
It's very, very difficult actually. You need
And
a
understandable.
yes.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
in
It's,
a way.
it is. Yeah. And as you say, it's hard to know quite how you can resist that. But there's been a lot of activity now by the trade unions, not surprisingly, and yeah, quite a lot of protests, and some people being sacked even for taking part in those protests. So yeah. Anyway, shouldn't be so depressing.
But it is.
It is depressing actually. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you judge the new managerial ethics? Have you some high estimation of it, or do you only criticize it, or a mixture of the...
I think a mixture. I mean, what I've characterised as new managerial ethics is, I think, there is the reason why some of the procedures and systems were introduced was to introduce a fairness, and to make sure that it wasn't just a question of if you got a nice social worker or a bad social worker, or if you lived in a particular area or another area. So that concern, I think, with fairness and thinking, we have to think about how to distribute resources because there are fewer resources. So I think, those elements are good and important. And some of the managers that I've interviewed have said that they believe in what they're doing. But I think it's when it just gets taken too far, when people are unthinkingly following the rules, when really the rules could be changed or broken because they're getting more and more detailed and they don't take account of every single case. And it's obviously eroding people's critical capacities and the good professional discretion and autonomy that makes for perhaps a good decision.
Could you tell something more about the implications for the student curriculum, the education? For instance, how can you teach abuse students with performance? You can deal with performance work and do ethics in life.
Yes. I think that is a big challenge for us, and I don't know if it's the same here in Holland, but the universities are often criticised for spending too much time on ethics and politics, and we send out students who are very ethically aware, but then they land in practice and they can't fill in a form or do the right procedures. And so somehow or other we need to train students and make them much more aware of the practical and political sphere that they're going into so that they can cope with that, but also do it in a humane way, which is where the ethics comes in. But I think that is a very, very hard thing to do because for students there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of how do you develop moral courage and the ability to blow the whistle, etc. In students. All we can do, I think, is work on their ethical sensitivity and that critical analysis of the climate that they're going into so that they're not apolitical, that they know what's going on, why it's going on, and they do, if they wish, join trade unions, become part of a collective of social workers. What happens a lot now, I think social workers feel very isolated, they're working very hard, they don't have time to go to meetings or do training or come into the universities. So perhaps we could do more actually to try to offer more continuous professional development, getting students to come back in once they've qualified. But I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer to that question. Yeah.
Does that mean that you think that you can teach students moral courage?
Well, I don't think you can exactly teach it, but I guess we can try to encourage people to develop that quality by working in groups, by looking at role models, by encouraging ethical awareness and sensitivity. Because for many people, if they see a situation as a case of injustice, then they may or may not act, but just being able to see it clearly for a start off is helpful. Whether they're then able to and motivated to act and to be courageous is another matter. But rehearsing the idea and talking about the possibility that one can take some action can be helpful. But it isn't possible, I think, just to indoctrinate people in moral courage, unfortunately. But even just talking about it, as you no doubt find when you talk about a particular case with a group of students, they all see something different and they would all act in a slightly different way, and they're giving each other ideas about what they could do, and maybe getting the courage can be by talking to your neighbour and doing something with the neighbour and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Maybe biological, we're all moral beings, but because of fate we have many problems, and then maybe we don't act so for moral correctly. So when we look to education, and role models and so on,
Yeah.
literature, poetry.
Yeah.
Then we learned our lessons, maybe, in groups and so on. But when we act in real life,
Yeah.
then we have faith.
Yes.
And what do we do with that when we have to act with courage and so on?
Mm.
Then we have to make our own decisions every
Yes.
time.
Yes. Yeah. So you're saying it's much more difficult when you're actually out there on your own,
It's more
Faced-
complex
faced with a decision. Yes, it is. Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure you'll do this, but I mean, what I notice when working with students, and then as they go out and practice, and talking to them later when they come back and tell about what they're doing, the way in which they do grow and develop, and they recognise some of the people who tell the stories of the cases. I said not many talk about being moral bystanders, but many talk about moral distress. But then that kind of shift, oh, well, maybe I can do something. Because a lot of students' stories are about watching what's going on and seeing it's bad. And that gradual feeling, well, yes, I do know what's right, so I could take some action here. I've half done this before, next time I'll do it differently. So that idea of encouraging people to sort of reflect and think and move on, I think does work to some extent. But it's a very, very tough job, I think, incredibly tough job to be a social worker at the moment. Yeah.
Are there more questions at the moment?
Yes. Sarah, you were talking
Yeah.
about the tension between ethics and politics, and you also stressed that everyday ethics should also be political.
Mm.
What would be your advice to social workers concerning political activities?
Mm.
Should they take stance against recent developments, or should they shift their goal? Because in the Netherlands, most workers are very pragmatic.
Yeah.
Shouldn't it be more
Yeah.
political?
Yeah. It's very easy for me, you see, as an academic to say social workers should be more political, because even though I think I have much less academic freedom than I used to, I still can do quite a lot of things that it would be very hard for social workers to do. But I think it's an obvious answer, but I think they have to join trades unions and talk to each other and set up their own networks of solidarity and collectivity. It still may not be easy, but if there's a group of people who are noticing an injustice or an unfairness, or a way in which the policy is actually not working as it should, then they probably can do something about it, even in small ways. And I think part of the problem with the term politics is we think it must mean large-scale political action and resistance and demonstrations, but it's also there on the everyday basis. So noticing that something's not going right and actually just reporting it or challenging the manager and putting the argument. I mean, that's where the reasoning does come in, doesn't it? Putting the argument as to why this is actually contrary to another policy, or isn't giving the best deal, or could bring the department into disrepute, or could cause a scandal. But that does require quite a bit of effort and work when people are very, very busy, and the courage. So I think it is tough. In the UK, as you're probably aware, we have the Social Work Action Network, which has been going now for about 10 years. Actually, it's the 10th anniversary this year, which is a coalition of academics, service users, students and social work practitioners promoting radical social work. And that organisation has conferences. The next one's in Durham, actually, in April, if any of you are interested, and tries to bring together the service users with the social workers and the academics. So taking a particular issue, particularly unfair policies. So we had a particular policy about personalisation, which sounded good. It was giving people personalised care packages, but actually it was about cutbacks and not really giving them enough. So getting together groups of people with disabilities and the social workers who are having to implement the policies, and talking to the members of parliament, the politicians, getting in the newspapers, that kind of thing, can have an effect. But the social workers have to recognise that they're able to do that kind of thing and be put in touch with other people who are similarly doing that.
Do you also pay attention to this aspect, political aspect, in your university, in teaching?
Yes, and the university as a whole, it's more difficult, but in our section, of course, we do. So some of the recent research I've been doing, which I was talking about earlier, was about working with people who have very high levels of debt, who have had loans from what we call predatory lenders, so these private lenders who payday loans. Do you have these? Wonga, does that ring a bell? Yeah. And others who go around knocking on doors offering people loans which the interest can be about 1,000%, and very poor people take out these loans and get into debt. So we worked with a community organisation and we exposed some of these practices, and we worked with a group of policymakers to try and get more regulation for these lenders, and we ran campaigns and public meetings. So that's what I mean by it's easier for me to do that because I'm in the university and somehow the university seems to allow me to do that, but not so easy for some of the social workers to do that. So we do, and we try to encourage the students to see political action as being part of their role insofar as they can do that. Yeah.